Missing is the peacock.
We might be better off on PBS, you know.
Good evening, and welcome to our first in the author series here at UUTC. Some of you are with us in person, some of you are watching our live stream, and some of you are watching a recorded version of this at a later date. In whatever way you see us, we're glad you're here. Later in the hour, you'll have an opportunity to ask us questions. If you're watching online, you can use the chat box to do so, and our sound people will relay those questions to us. I'm really excited about our program tonight. An opportunity to get to know Dr. Gus Napier, a nationally recognized family therapist and teacher, as he takes us through his classic book on family therapy, The Family Crucible. This 1978 book has sold hundreds of thousands of copies and is still a foundational text used in training therapists all over the world, as is Gus's other book, The Fragile Bond, which is about the dynamics of marriage. I've read both books and enjoyed both while learning so much about the dynamics of the family and within a marriage. I'm also proud to count Gus as a good friend.
Me too.
Gus, it's so good to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Jim. I count you as a good friend as well.
You've had a long and highly successful career as a psychotherapist, speaking and teaching all over the country. But you actually began as a poet and entered college as an English major. What happened to change that? And what drew you to family therapy?
Well, how long do we have? I thought I would be a poet. I worked with Richard Wilbur, who was one of the most gracious people in all of the literary world, and he encouraged me. But what happened is that I graduated from college, and I hit a crisis that was really quite profound in my life. I really wasn't prepared for so much that was coming, and I figured out by being in huge distress. And so I went into therapy, strongly encouraged by my mother, who was always, the person whom I turned to. And I got caught up in the world of therapy, and then family therapy, and decided to go to graduate school in psychology, which was at UNC Chapel Hill. And when I came out of that program in 1968, family therapy had hit the mental health world. And it was the most popular draw at the conferences, and there were papers coming out and new journals being started. It was a very exciting moment. And this convergence of issues was very complex, but it had to do with, I think, with the social ferment of the 1960s. And it also had to do with increasing awareness of human systems and how they behaved. There was the beginnings of the space program, the cybernetics science that was coming out of that, but there were many other contributors. And then the world of family constellations, family systems, began to work its way into actual practice. And this happened through research into the behavior of schizophrenics, studying what happened when the schizophrenic patient who'd gotten well in the hospital went back home and regressed, what happened in mental health centers where there was a child guidance movement, and therapists who work with adolescents discovered that suddenly they were dealing with the dynamics of marriage, not something they intended to do. At any rate, family therapy began to be a very exciting field. And I was drawn to it, the power that I saw in it, and the potential for for helping families. So what happened is that the family emerged as the focus of change in the society. And excitement about that just took me over.
Well, you talk about family therapy, and I must admit that I was pretty ignorant about it until I read your book. What's family therapy all about, and how is it different than the kind of therapy most of us are familiar with?
Well, it's radically different. I think that's the first thing, that it's a reconceptualization of what the problems are and where they lie. The family, in my view, is the basic social unit in any culture, the group that's going to raise the next generation. And I think Freud did us all a disservice by saying that the problems in people's lives are in their inner struggles. And he didn't really look at the way the family shaped them. He turned away from the family. And so what family therapy does is it reconceptualizes the nature and the locus of the problem. The problem is in families. And it's not just the family that lives together. Families transmit their history across the generations. So that you have, in this case, in this book, you have grandparents, parents, you have the teenage kids, the parents, and then grandparents, who quickly becomes obvious that they're part of the problem as well. So the system began to spread and diversify, and as Margaret and I later began to practice together, we routinely involved the older generation in our therapy. So basically the problem moved from an individual to a system. And I think it was the right move, and I think it has profound potential that even today has not been realized.
Well, you worked with a man named Dr.
Carl Whitaker, yes.
And for a number of years, and I believe he was also your mentor.
He was.
And he's also the co-author of The Family Crucible. And we get a chance to...
This is an in-joke.
I think I know what it is. Actually, I believe this is really Gus's book.
It is really Gus's book.
And Gus did about probably 95 or more %.
I wrote every word in the book. Okay.
Let's go
But
back.
its inspiration was Carl Whitaker.
Well, let's go back to him for a minute, because he plays a significant part as a co-therapist with you.
Yes.
In working with the family that's the focus of this book. And we'll get into the specifics of all of that later on. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about your history with Carl Whitaker. And he comes across in the book as being incredibly different in his approach to therapy, and really totally unconventional in some ways,
yes.
and quite surprising and even shocking in some of the things that he says and does.
Yes.
So would you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, Carl was raised on a dairy farm in upstate New York, decided to go into medicine and went into OBGYN, and a patient who was in for a routine surgery died because the anesthesia machine exploded, and it horrified him, and he decided to go into a field where he wouldn't be involved in anybody dying. Well, that was probably not. This field also had its dangers, but Carl was an unusually brilliant and radical guy. I mean, he said crazy things. He was known as a kind of wild man of psychotherapy, but he was incredibly insightful. He could be incredibly empathic, and he was just a remarkable individual. I loved him. I worked with him. I learned from him. And eventually I had to leave. When somebody introduced me as Carl Whitaker Jr., I knew this was not a place I could stay.
Talk a little bit bit about that history. I believe you were in Wisconsin at the time.
In Wisconsin, I went to Wisconsin Department of Psychiatry to study with Carl, and I did just that. He had become a family therapist, and I was drawn to his thinking, his character.
He was one of the pioneers in
He
this
was
field.
one of about 4 or 5 who built the field. And he was certainly the most radical, the most innovative. So my life was changed in important ways by working with him. He was intrusive. He could be intrusive. He could be incredibly caring. He could be off the wall in terms of what he said. But he was a good-hearted person and a brilliant person, and I owe him a lot.
And how long did you work with him in Wisconsin?
10 years. That's about what it takes to train a heart surgeon. And Carl often used a medical metaphor. He said, family therapy is open heart surgery, and you need a team. You can't do it by yourself. He also said you need to have a personal stake in the work. You need to share your feelings. You need to be able to be involved. Because what he said was that what's curative in therapy, in family therapy, is a powerful encounter experience in the therapy. So he saw the therapist necessary to taking risks, to moving in closely, to being confrontive sometimes, but he also saw the danger of getting lost in the family. So he said, you've got to have somebody with you to help you and to bring you out when you get in over your head, or to see it differently. And he and I saw the world of the family quite differently. I was sort of the straight guy who was willing to explain things and teach. And he was modeling a kind of radical conversation, which is, I think, what we really need to get somewhere in an intimate relationship. We need more radical conversations that go farther, deeper.
One of the things that really surprised me about this whole process was this co-therapist
Yes.
approach. And I learned that when one therapist gets stuck,
Yes.
well, the other one can come in and bail them out.
Yes.
Or reframe something.
Yes.
So that if it looks like things are going in the wrong direction, they can reframe something and,
Yes.
and move it back in the right direction.
Or support the other therapist in some cases. We sort of learned almost to read each other's minds in doing the work. We kind of knew where the other person was going.
And there must be a great deal of comfort in knowing that somebody else is there
Yes.
to do exactly that, to
Yes.
bail you out
Yes.
in case something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Is that the normal approach now in family therapy, to have co-therapists in the room at the same time?
Unfortunately, it is not. The insurance industry, business, has really made that difficult. Margaret and I spent 20 years practicing together, and we each cut our separate rates in order to be able to work together. But insurance, the whole medical model where the individual is the patient, and that's the way the industry is organized, makes it very hard for therapists to insist on having a team, and it's really weakened the approach, I think.
Talk a little bit about, now you worked with him in Wisconsin for 8 years.
Yes.
But then you moved to Atlanta and worked with him for a good deal.
No, moved to Atlanta really to get away from him.
Oh, okay.
It was not possible to have the kind of independence I needed to have. And so Margaret and I had started working together in Wisconsin. This is Margaret in the front row here.
We're going to talk to Margaret later on. We're going to give her an opportunity to give her perspective
Yes.
on all of this.
I look forward to hearing that.
How did his work affect you personally? And also, how did it affect your marriage?
Interesting. It made me bolder. I'm a soft-spoken Southerner, and it taught not to rock the boat, and it helped me rock the boat. I could do bolder things, and I think it affected our marriage in that it was so engrossing. Carl's personality, the power of the patience, all of that engrossing activity was competition for the family experience for a while. When we moved to Atlanta, things changed dramatically for us, and we began working together pretty much full-time.
Well, let's talk a little bit now, or let's talk more than a little bit about the family itself, the Bryce family.
Yes, okay.
And who are the focus of this book. This is a family of 5 people, a husband and wife, a teenage daughter named Claudia, I think it was 12-year-old boy or somewhere.
Probably 13,
okay.
yeah.
Named Don, and then a little girl,
Laura,
named Laura.
about 7.
And the father's name was David.
David.
The mother's name, I think, was Carol.
Carolyn,
Is that right?
yes, thank you.
How did they come to you, Gus?
Well, that's an interesting question, and always important. Claudia was in full rebellion.
This is a teenager.
The teenager, 15, about to be 16, and she was running away from home. She was having pretty promiscuous sex with several guys. She would stay out for 2-3 days. She was really out of control. And they managed to get her to see a psychiatrist who worked a lot with adolescents. And what happened in that relationship is that her behavior got worse. She saw being sent to a psychiatrist as another form of control. So she stonewalled the psychiatrist, and he realized that, wait, she's not getting better. And along comes somebody, a friend of the father in this case, who hears his complaints about the child psychiatrist, and he said, listen, let me tell you about family therapy. And this was a physician who'd been trained in the Department of Psychiatry. So he told the father about family therapy, and that led them to request a referral to Carl, who was the family therapist at Wisconsin. So that's how they got there. But the focus was on this very troubled 15, 16-year-old girl, and she was really in trouble. The child psychiatrist had labeled her as potentially a schizophrenic, which, as we got to know her, seemed quite absurd. This was an angry, distressed teenager. And the diagnosis was way off. But the referral was really wise. It was a good thing for the family. But they came in focused on her problems, her issues. And I could talk about the beginning stages of that.
I'd like you to do that, but
okay.
first I'd like you to just kind of give us a little sketch
of the family. Okay.
The father,
sure.
What he was doing, the mother.
Yes, thank you.
And also, it's set in the time period, I think, of about the early to middle 70s. Is that correct?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a time when women were beginning to
yes.
leave the home or were being encouraged to
yes.
Be something other than mothers and wives.
Yes.
And homemakers.
And I'll get to that.
A really important part of that
absolutely.
later on in the book, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
But give us a little sketch of each person in
yes.
the family.
Well, the father was in actuality, a professor. In the book, he's a lawyer. Not much difference. Absorbed in his books, his work, really absorbed in his work. And pretty distant guy. The mother was homemaker, housewife, and I think very unhappy in that role. Didn't know it so much at the time, but she seemed sad. The father withdrawn, self-preoccupied, the mother sad, and kind of bitter, and angry. And beneath all that, there was a great deal of richness. The daughter, Claudia, I think basically a sweet person, but the facade of anger and rebellion was all over her, and as the problem was broadened, she just eased up. And I'll tell you a little bit about the major crisis that she had. The boy, Don, let's say 13, he's impudent, kind of a wisecracker, teasing, not serious, smart. They were all smart. And his diffidence was a major thing. The girl, who was 6, 7, was incredibly sweet. She seemed innocent, as if she didn't follow all this. But as we got into the work, clearly she'd heard everything. She knew everything.
This is Laura,
Laura, the youngest. She's 6, maybe becomes 7. So rather than looking innocent after she was invited into she was clearly very perceptive about everything, and she worried about issues like, was her sister going to commit suicide? She was also a vehicle for tender connections with the family. At the end of the first major interview, Carl kind of sat down on the floor and just played with her a little bit in a very warm way. So she was a vehicle for expressing tenderness to the family. Go ahead.
There was a whole lot of stuff suppressed in this entire family.
Absolutely.
And let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
And about how you went to draw some of this out.
Yes.
Because therapy's hard work.
Yep.
And usually you have people who don't want to admit their own failings or their own weaknesses
Yes.
or their own problems.
Yep.
And getting them to do that is sometimes a
Yes.
long process. How long were these people was this family in therapy?
I think about 1.5 years.
Okay.
Pretty short by some standards.
By some standards, what can happen with a family in therapy? How long is, you said 1.5 years is fairly short compared to, how long can this go on?
Well, it depends upon the severity of the problem. Margaret and I, in our own practices, had some families who were very disturbed, had very disturbing childhoods. And we worked with them for several years, 4 or 5 years. So I think it depended in part on the severity of the issues and the foresight of the people.
I was going to say, their willingness to
Absolutely,
sure.
yep. Mm-hmm.
Sure. All right, let's talk a little bit more about this particular family and how things started and how they moved. One of the things that I found really compelling about the book, the insight, is the incredible dynamics within a family and how they shift and how they are created or exacerbated by the whole chain of genealogy that goes way into the past. So talk about that a little bit.
Okay, this couple were pretty shut down, separated emotionally. They hadn't started out that way, and I think that's often true in marriage, that the marriage has a sort of a fantasy in our culture as the relationship that will solve everything. you know, your best friend, your therapist. Marriage will be everything. And as couples go into these marriages, they found disappointment. They get afraid of how dependent they are on each other, and they begin to back away and cool down. And this was a very cool system. They had really, a lot of the emotional life had been pushed away. And we began to see that the daughter's dilemma was part of a way that the marriage could become more alive. For example, Claudia went to her father sometime for support, which made her mother jealous. And so a triangle was created there, and that triangle became the focus for the emotional life of the couple. So Claudia was like a source of disturbance that kept the couple confronting each other. But
they were doing it often through her?
Through her,
right?
That's right. She was the way they were fighting. They fought through her. And that's a pretty bad thing to be in the middle of. It's pretty traumatic. And later we saw this process focused to Don, the second child, and the second focus in the family. So we call this the rotating scapegoat. So the family didn't resolve the marriage issues. They simply moved on to another kid.
And that brings up another thing that the book really makes clear, is that there's kind of a shifting focus. First it was Claudia.
Then it was Don.
Then it was Don, and then it was Carolyn, I believe.
Yes.
And then it was David.
Yes, David was last.
He was last. And so you work through some of the stuff with the person who's the focus of, and that brings up things in the other people there.
Yes.
Which eventually shifts the focus to them. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. But the aim is to get the couple to face their own dilemmas. Families protect themselves from the vulnerable exposure of marital issues. And this couple was afraid of conflict with each other, afraid of losing each other, and afraid of being direct with each other. So really, without those pieces, without the couple shifting their relationship, the basic tone and tenor of the family couldn't change. So the core work becomes marital. And with a couple so shut down and afraid of each other in some ways, it was very tricky work to get into that marriage.
If I remember, we were talking about the cultural aspect of this. That the father was very involved in his work.
He was.
Spent huge amounts of time on that, which meant he was not involved with the family.
Yes.
Mother was tied to the house. And resented the fact that she couldn't express some of her desires and some of her wants. Get outside the house. And as this whole thing escalated, their ability to communicate with each other just kind of disappeared.
And the dynamic that created the dramatic change came from how abandoned the wife felt, Carolyn felt, by the husband's preoccupation with his work. So that was a critical issue. And it was really our way into the interior of the marriage. Not all couples, not all families are afraid of conflict in the way this couple was. But to an extent, the fear of conflict tells you how much they valued each other, how much they depended upon each other, how afraid they were to lose each other. But the key work is in the marriage.
Let's talk about Carolyn a little bit.
Okay.
Because Carolyn became really a key piece of this whole story.
She did.
Maybe the key piece of the
I
story.
think the key piece, what we realized is that she was not engaged. She came, she was sometimes looked frightened, but if the mother is not engaged with the family work on a deep level, it's not going to go anywhere because she is so much the emotional center. So we worried about how how withdrawn she seemed and really uncommitted to the process.
How did that change? How did you get that to change?
Well, I'm not sure we got it to change, but it did change. Finally, they got around to dealing with conflict with each other. They began to argue with each other, directly to each other, not through the kids. And that was a discouraging process. And I'm going to describe what led up to the critical event. They were blaming each other, but she ascribed feelings to him that didn't resonate to him. She said, "You don't care about me." And he said, "You have no right to tell me what my feelings are." And that went a little distance. And he said, "Well, I think this is accurate memory." He said, "Well, maybe I should just leave." And she said, "Maybe you should, because you don't seem here anyway. You're not here. You're not with me." And that was a pretty stark moment where they think about giving up. And she said, "But what I can tell you about me is that I am terribly sad and alone. I am heartbroken by how alone I feel." And it was a really startling thing to say. And I said, "Are you feeling like giving up?" And not only did I see this, but Claudia had seen this earlier. There was a scene in which Claudia escalated her anger as she saw her mother being more passive and threatening to give up. And so we identified that. But here is the issue again. Carolyn giving up. And she really looked incredibly sad. And I claimed this. I think Carl and I did it together. I said, "Why don't you give up? Why don't you give up trying to change him and just be with yourself?" And we had a sense, both of us, Carl and I, that it was like the tumblers on a lock clicked. It was so electric, this moment, this potential that there was something was going to happen, and it was going to happen in Carolyn. And so, and we later thought of it as inviting her to fall downstairs. But we were being quite caring with her. And what she did was break into heart-breaking sobs. She just started weeping. And it was the most powerful weeping. And everybody in the room was galvanized by the fact that Mother was desperately sad. And it went on for a while. And so after a while, we sort of comforted her. And we began to coach her on staying with herself. Pay attention to your breathing. Think about where you are in your body. Just let yourself be in your body. And at some point, she started to go, as if to go back to the fight with David. And we said, don't. Just stay with you. And we encouraged her to close her eyes and just breathe. And it was just a profound moment. And it's what we call a decisive moment or an existential shift in the family.
What happened as a result of that?
Well,
usually in therapy, you're time limited.
Yes, we ran over.
And I assume an hour, or maybe with a family it's longer than that, I don't know.
Yes.
But anyway, you hit the end of that hour, or whatever the time was, and people then go home and process whatever has happened. So
We were worried.
yeah, you must have been.
Absolutely worried. What's going to happen next? But we just sort of, with our voices, held her, cuddled her verbally. And after a while, Carl said, I guess we have to stop. As if, can we stop? And so they went home. A couple of days later, they called us, and we thought there was big trouble brewing. And what we said was, it was David, he called me, knowing that I had probably a closer connection with Carolyn. And he said, she's crying, she's been crying for an hour. What should I do? And I had a hunch that what he should do is not involve us. I said, stay with her. Just stay with her. And they got in the car and drove, and he put his arm around her shoulder, and after a while, she let him stroke her on the cheek or something like that. So we helped him do at home some of what had happened in the office. He saw the need to be tender with her, and he did.
And what happened to her?
It's the best story of the book, I think. She had a kind of renaissance. She really began to be much more independent in relationship to him. There was a party they went to. He talked to his lawyer friends or professor friends, and then he wanted to go home. And she liked to dance. She said, well, you go on home, and I'll stay, and I'll get a ride home with, and she named a friend who was there without her husband. She stayed at the party until 1:30. And so she began to experiment with herself, with more independence from him. And she went on from there. She really began a transformation in her life.
She went out and got a job eventually.
She eventually got a master's degree in something. And so that direction of more self-actualization happened to her. And the family survived. The marriage survived. And she was a trooper in her exploration of the world. And of course, that was happening to many of us as we went into marriage with one set of expectations, and the world changed.
Yeah, your second book,
Yeah.
The Fragile Bond, really explores how we go into marriage and how we bring our families and our experience with our families
Yes.
with them, and all of the, let's say, faults or holes that have been created in as we grow up.
Yes.
We look to our partner to fill all those holes
Yes.
and solve all those problems.
Yeah.
And often go into marriage too young with idealistic expectations that
Yes.
are not met.
Yes. And so it is true that a little life experience before getting into marriage is a good idea.
Talk a little bit, and I think you brought something you could read. I'd love to have you read a passage from this. We're pushing our time here.
Oh my goodness. This is like a session.
But I have to tell you, this book reads like a novel. You are sitting in the room with this family and with Gus and with Carl Whitaker and participating really in this whole process. It's unlike any other psychology book I've ever read, and it illustrates Gus's ability with the English language, his background with language and so on. But it's beautifully written, and I'd love you to hear just a little piece of this.
Well, this is sort of the ending of this collapse of Carolyn's. Where do I start? Yes. You feel like giving up? I ask quietly. Yes. The profound passivity with which she spoke frightened me. I think you could risk it, I asked gently, daring her in a way which she did not expect. She looked up, puzzled. If you could, then changing the inflection to signal the shift in thought, try to change, give up trying to change him or to get approval from him. It might be the beginning of a whole new world. Carl and Carolyn looked directly at each other for a suspenseful moment. I'm sorry, I started that exchange and then it moved to Carl. Your world would then have you in the center of it, not him. The timing of the remark, Carolyn's mood, Carl's tone of voice, the couple's poised despair, all met with a precision that produced an almost audible click, as when the tumblers of a difficult lock fall into final combination. One knew that the door would open now, and something important would emerge. Whatever was going to happen, its locus was in Carolyn. So I'm essentially reading this. I spoke quietly. I'm real glad you can feel the hurt. I had the fantasy that Carl had led her through an open door to the edge of a long flight of stairs. The stairs were heavily carpeted, and they stretched downward a long, long distance into total darkness. We had pushed her down the stairs, saying, "Go ahead, fall," and she was tumbling down them in a blur of motion, both instantaneous and interminable. She was falling, and we who had pushed her had to catch her.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
It surprised me toward the end of this whole therapy session or therapy process that you didn't just have the immediate family there. Would you talk a little bit about what you did in bringing in others to this?
You know, I don't remember whether we brought Carolyn's mother in. I think we did. And I think they had an exchange. But the more dramatic one was with David. He remained the workaholic and the enigma, really. And at some point, kind of critically positioned in time, as Carolyn was beginning to emerge, he got a job offer from Boston, where his parents lived, Boston to Madison. And the job offer seemed kind of mysterious. Like, why? How did they know him? Well, he was a pretty well-known, in this case, in real life, a professor. And so David went to Boston to be interviewed and talk about the job. And Carolyn was plunged into despair. I mean, this would be the interruption of her progress, her community, her friend.
She was just beginning to
She was just beginning to blossom. So the timing, you always wonder about timing in these things. How can they be so badly timed? But it turned out that David's father, who was a dynamically successful business person, had been on the board of anyway, was the source of the job offer, and David was really bitter about that, so we brought his parents in, and there was kind of a showdown in which David talked about how hurt he was, how disillusioned he was, and he really made an impact, and I think it freed him up to really leave that family he'd grown up in. He'd always felt pressured by his father's success. But that's how David got more involved. And I'm glad we were able to get the parents in.
How many people did you get in the room at one time?
Well, in this instance, there were 5, 6, 7. There were 7. Margaret and I did much better than that.
Let's talk about you and Margaret, because we really are getting close.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the fragile bond. And one of the things that really struck me about this book is how open and revealing you are about your marriage, about each of you, the things that you brought to it, and things that most people would never talk about, even to a close friend. And they're all in here.
I think
Yes,
so. How
please
about a
do.
microphone? How about a microphone? Okay.
Yes, we'd like to have you have a microphone so that people can hear you, because they won't hear you. I'd love people to see you, and I think all they're seeing is your back here, because we do have a camera back there. But you and Gus worked as co-therapists for 20 years. That seems to me, I've been married for 58 years. And Alice, my wife Alice, is sitting right here.
57.
We've been married for 58 years. And from my point of view, this seems to be a relationship fraught with all kinds of possibilities for conflict. And so I would love to hear about that and hear how you both dealt with that as you were navigating this 20 years together.
Silence.
How about how we got into it, doing it?
Well, that's a nice story, actually.
Please.
We were still living in Madison, and Gus was treating a couple where the wife was pregnant, and she was an academic, and she was in her 30s and extremely nervous about the pregnancy, and physically and emotionally, and what it was going to mean for her life. And I had just given birth to our 3rd child, and I was the director of a progressive school in Madison. And Gus said to me one day, "Would you just come in and talk to the mother, the wife in this family?" And I said, well, yeah, I had a master's degree in psychology, so I had a kind of credential to do that. So I came into the session, and I brought infant Julia with me. And we just went from session to session. She held the baby, she played with the baby, I talked to her about the experience of giving birth, and the baby was born, and we kept on in this process. And I brought Julia, she brought the baby, they played on the floor together. The funniest part about it was that we saw this couple for a long time.
We did.
When the child was about 2 years old, we discovered that he was calling Gus and Margaret.
One word.
And he didn't have a word for me.
It didn't stay that way.
But that's how we started. And then when we moved to Atlanta, I got certified as a marriage and family therapist, and we started working together routinely. There were 3 other people in our practice, and we both sometimes did co-therapy with them, but we really liked doing it with each other. And it's a kind of dance. You know, you intuitively know where your partner's going in the process, and you either drop back and let him work with one member of the family, or if one of you is going to challenge somebody in the family, the other one serves as a support
So you can
for
almost
that
be good
person.
cop, bad cop in a
Yes,
way?
indeed, exactly, yes. Gus is very conceptual, and so he did a lot of that part of the therapy, and I'm pretty willing to take emotional risks, and so I would move in and do something disturbing to one member of a couple, and Gus would interpret it or support that person. Just hang on, listen to what she's saying, there's a reason for this, that kind of thing. But we also modeled a marriage where both members of the couple can challenge each other or can be intimate in front of other people in how they speak to each other.
How long had you been married when you started working together?
Gus, let's see.
63.
We married in 63, we moved to Atlanta in 79. So we've been married a long time.
Yeah.
16 years.
It was kind of a hobby at first. It's something we did together. When we moved to Atlanta, I said, Margaret, I need help. The book had come out, and people were just, they were a lot of challenges there. And so we started working in ways that we had not worked before. But
I'd like to stop for just a minute because we only have about 10 minutes left, and I promised people they could ask questions.
yes,
if they'd like.
indeed.
Do we
Yeah.
have any questions from online? Not yet. Anybody here in the audience would like to ask a question? Yes, hang on just a minute. We'll get you a microphone and then you can,
Do you want me to
Sure, go ahead.
interpret or give it a microphone?
she can talk. Well, we were a little concerned about the COVID thing, but I think
Yeah.
it'll be all right here.
So I was just interested, Gus, you had given kind of a follow-up on the mother, the mother, Carolyn, and on the father, David, but I was really curious about Claudia because she was such a central character, at least initially. The focus had really been on her, and she had been in so much distress. And I
Yes.
was just curious, how did things turn out for her?
We didn't have a long-term follow-up, but she seemed to be on her way. I mean, she brightened up. She focused on her own life. She did well in school. I mean, all the indications were that she had been released to be, a normal late teenage kid. And she seemed to be enormously relieved not to be in the old role. So I think she did quite well.
I think one of the questions people want to know is, did you feel the therapy was successful for this particular family?
Yes.
And how do you decide that?
I don't think we do. I think it takes time for the family to sort of live into that. But we didn't get any distress calls. We didn't see any evidence of distress from them. The father had been very reticent about being exposed. He had made me change some descriptions of the father to conceal, well, in his case, as kind of a stoop shoulder. And he began to go around Madison saying, well, we were the family in the book.
So much for anonymity.
There you go.
That was a few years.
That was a few years. Yes, we heard that later. But it was a warm ending that seemed to be very good.
Anybody else have a question? Yes.
Hi, Gus. So
Hey.
in the book, there's that part where Dawn trips over one of your feet and gets in an altercation with Carl.
Yes.
And I know in the book, you backed him up and all that, but I was just wondering, what was that like for you when that happened? Like, because that just sounded so unconventional.
Yes.
Gus, can you find that
What was
spot
going
in
through
the
your
book?
mind, and what was it like for you?
Oh, can I
Can you
find
that
it?
spot in the book?
Spot?
Because that really illustrates, thank you for that question.
Yes,
That
indeed.
really illustrates how unconventional Carl Whitaker was. He ends up in a physical fight with this 13-year-old boy.
Well, Carl and Don had irritated each other the whole time. Carl came from a family with a very stern father, and he wasn't, I don't think, a stern father, but the idea of a kid that lippy rubbed him the wrong way. And what happened is that Don kind of stumbled. He was trying to get out of the room. He knocked Carl's glasses off, and they clattered onto the floor. And this happened before I knew it was going to happen. It just happened. But I think it was the arrogance of the kid that tempted Carl to do this. But what he did was basically hold the kid down. He didn't hurt him.
But he got right on the floor with this.
Yes,
kid,
he
right?
did. Yes, he did. And it was pretty startling, but it was Carl Whitaker, you know. Later, we worked with a family in Atlanta, and I think they had perhaps read the book because a kid challenged me in almost the same way. And I wound up having to sit on him. He started to slug his father, and I just couldn't let that happen. So, but this was a kind of permission to be involved that was pretty remarkable.
One of the things that comes through here is the close connection
Uh-huh.
that the therapists have with the people in the room.
Yes.
I mean, you know, a lot of what we see is the sort of austere
Right. Yes.
therapist who
Yes.
sits there and just is quiet or
Yes.
maybe asks a question once in a while. You really got involved.
Boring, the other one.
I think
Can
that
you,
what makes a difference for a family is being loved.
Yes. Yep.
And I think that the sense that the people who are sitting in the room with you care deeply about you is so it transmits so quickly over time that people take risks that they've never taken before because you're holding them.
there's
and your
you're
love.
creating a real sense of trust.
Yes.
Yes.
That they can share things with you that they wouldn't share with other people.
Right,
Is that
and
right?
that they'll be safe with you.
And it's not something that's manufactured.
It's real.
It's
I
real.
mean, if you don't grow from every couple and family you see, then you're not doing your job.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be open to following them places they need to go and that are growthful for you, too.
This takes a real risk on your part too,
Yes,
doesn't
it
it?
Yes.
does.
I think
really
that what Carl said one time, the person who grows the most from the therapy process is the therapist. And I think that's true because I think in order to be good therapists and caring, we have to develop empathy. And it really has to be real.
No, you can't.
Can't fake it.
No.
Yep. Sometimes we would start work with a couple and say to ourselves, how can we stand to be in the room with these unpleasant people? And a year later, we love them.
Because you got to know them.
Because they got to know them. And
Well,
have,
and because their pain drew you to them,
yeah,
and their courage. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to bring your family in
it does.
to be examined.
Yeah.
I hate to bring this to an end. We're
No.
at that point. I'm going to play the therapist here and say the hour's up.
Somebody has to call time.
But this has been wonderful, and it really has. You can get this book on Amazon. It's readily available, and I highly recommend it. It's just an amazing read and an amazing look into not only this family, but and the process of therapy, but into your own situation. I mean, there are a lot of times when you say, wow, I went through this, or I felt the same way. So I really encourage you to read it. I'd like to thank you, Gus, for this.
And thank you, Jim,
I've
for,
enjoyed working with you as we prepared for this.
Me
and
too.
Margaret as well.
yeah.
And I'd like to thank R.K. Young and our technical crew, who you can't see, Catherine Burley and Doug Wilkes, for their help. And thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening. On October 19th, we'll present Nicola Koresh in the second installment of our author series. She'll be interviewed by Sheila Mooney, and I know many of you know Sheila, and we'll share her writing and her work with the Rosenwald community in Brevard. As you know, many of you who read the Transylvania Times, Nicola does a semi-weekly or bi-weekly article on the Rosenwald community. And we hope you'll join us then. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you, Jim.
Welcome. Thank you. I really